introduce to you Dr. Megha Anwer. Dr. Anwer is a clinical assistant professor and director of diversity, inclusion, and equity at the Honors College. She's also a Provost Fellow in the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. In her work, she's really passionate about understanding and promoting DEI through the study of literature and visual culture. She has published in many journals and anthologies, including the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, which might very well be the coolest journal I've ever known. So if you ever need a collaborator to submit to the journal, again, let me know. And I heard that Dr. Anwer is currently working on a book related to neoliberal precarity in Bollywood cinema. That's also another interesting thing that we should stay tuned for. Dr. Anwer takes many and varied creative steps to help promote inclusive education at our university. In her classrooms, she teaches how power dynamics impact both visual and literal cultural products in movies and in photography, for example. She also actively promotes critical self-awareness and use active learning strategies to increase engagement in class. She also designed and launched the Purdue Institute for Racial Equity that offers opportunity for staff, faculty, and students to learn more about racial bias and how the bias impacts our daily life. Dr. Anwer has received multiple grants and awards. I'm not going to name all of them, but I want to highlight that recently in 2021, she was the recipient of the Exceptional Early Career Teaching Award at Purdue University. And this is an honor for exceptional undergrad teaching with the rank of assistant professor. So congratulations, Dr. Anwer. Today, we're really grateful to have Dr. Anwer to share with us about inclusive mentoring, understanding who we are and how we support our students. So please join me and welcome Dr. Anwer.
Frankie, that was the most generous and embarrassing, I don't know, introduction that I've ever had said about me that I didn't write myself. So I just want to put it out there. That was not me. That's all Frankie. And I don't know. That's really impressive work on sort of researching me. I am grateful for that so much. If it's all right with everyone, hi Nasreen, it's good to see you here. In fact, it's good to see so many familiar names and faces and unfamiliar ones. That's even more exciting. I hope we can keep connecting, even after this event. If it's all right with folks, I'm going to share my screen and just do the logistics part of this before we get started. Is that good for everyone? Can everyone see my slides? Yeah, I can see Adam's head nodding and Kip's thumbs up. Thank you. I want to start by thanking you for joining me this evening, for inviting me to present at the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Science Consortium. A very special thank you to Frankie and Kelly for coordinating us and being such easy and wonderful colleagues to collaborate with. I'm very excited to be in your midst. And what I hope to talk about today is inclusive mentoring. There are many reasons why I've chosen this focus for today's presentation. My personal motivation is a simple one, really. In many ways, today's presentation is my way of expressing gratitude for the abiding mentoring relationships and networks within which I found not just amazing sort of lifelong, life-altering friendships, but also really, in many ways, I found myself in these relationships, On a less personal, or rather more political, personal, professional note, and here you can already see the ways in which mentoring blurs the lines between these categories, right? I've selected this topic because we're at an important cusp in our university. For a while now, Purdue has been focusing on the importance of mentoring our students, right? There's a whole section we have to write about in our promotion tenure Form 36 about mentoring. And now, particularly with the latest additions made to Form 36, recently passed by the Senate, and our promotion tenure processes, we're being encouraged to consider the ways in which we as faculty attend to the DEI imperative, right? The diversity, equity, inclusion, and imperative in different facets of our work. And I think it's worthwhile for us to visit, or rather revisit, what we've been doing and doing well for a while, that is mentoring, right? And combine it with what we're being asked to do to document and translate for others within a DEI framework. So what is mentoring within a DEI framework is what I hope to explore with all of you today. The starting premise of the presentation is that many, if not most of us, are already really good mentors. Therefore, what I hope to do is to offer some theoretical frameworks that will allow us to break down and articulate what it is we do when we mentor well inclusively. And here you can see my central point is developing, which is that I'm making an argument that to mentor well is to mentor inclusively and vice versa. To mentor inclusively is to mentor well. These two are inextricably interlinked, intertwined, and today's workshop session is about exploring some ideas that will help us think about how we do it, right? Or how we can do it, and most crucially, why inclusive mentoring matters. So with that, I'm going to move to the next slide, which is where we can think about what we will take away from today's session, right? I want to begin with that point, which is why does inclusive mentoring matter? Because unless you know the stakes of a matter, it's hard to care about it, right? And within that context, I want us to think about mentoring as social capital. And then I want to share some frameworks for inclusive mentoring. Within that, I want to look particularly at critical self-awareness in mentoring, right? And I want us to think about asset framing versus deficit framing of the students we mentor. And then I want to move towards, I put it down under framework, but it's really under process, right? Like, how do we start the process of doing this work? How do we mentor students? How do we, first of all, select the students we mentor? How do we mentor students without tokenizing them? And this is a big one. I'm going to I culminate there, and that's where I'll try and make it very collaborative and sort of invite us to think together, because that's a question I get asked all the time, which is, how do I mentor my students without tokenizing them? So that's something I've put in there, right? I want to begin here with this definition, right? Like, I hope you folks can see it. It's slightly small, so peer into your screens, or I apologize if it's not very sort of conducive for the eyes. But I want to begin with this sort of definition of mentoring. This is a slide that the PIRE team, Frankie mentioned PIRE, and I'm going to just sort of talk about that for a second. I'm a part of this team, PIRE, uses when we're trying to get everyone on the same page to think about mentoring, right? PIRE, for those of you who don't know, is short for PIRE Institute for Racial Equity. I don't want you to get too attached to that name because we'll probably be changing it soon. But you know, or you can imagine, of course, that there are many, many definitions out there of what mentoring is. But this is a kind of composite compiled from many definitions based on what appears most often in different scholarships on mentoring, right? Which is, and here we can thank Dominguez and Cochin for this compilation. I'm going to give everyone a minute to go over the definition, right? And then I want us to do a quick exercise, if that's possible. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to look over the definition, the various components. And if you can, I invite you to drop in the chat the one element of mentoring that pops out at you from this definition, or from these sets of characteristics that define mentoring. It could be anything, right, that pops out at you, something you'd encountered as a part of your mentoring relationships repeatedly, something you've never experienced and wish you had, something you hadn't considered about mentoring before. Take a minute and drop it in the chat, something that struck you. And if you can add the why it strikes you, that would be great. And just as you're looking over it, I want to make explicit why we're doing this exercise, because I found that when something catches my eye, I fixate on it. And then when I learn about the other things that are catching other people's eyes, I start to think about the issue in this comprehensive, collaborative way, so that I don't just learn something new about the subject, but also something new about the people that I'm learning it with, you know? So please use the chat function, and if you can, drop the one element that jumped out at you. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, absolutely. It is a transformative experience, and it should be a positively transformative experience if it's done right. Thanks, Margot. Enduring personal aspects. Absolutely. There's a long durée dimension to mentoring. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nastasha, Bradley. I hope you're seeing what is striking different people, right? Like, what is it that folks are taking away? Yeah, absolutely. It's dynamic. The reciprocality of it. Thank you, Jason. We're going to talk about the reciprocality quite a bit. It's a learning partnership. Absolutely. There's a joint sort of togetherness to it. It is a partnership. Absolutely. An emotional bond. Emma, yeah, absolutely. You're also endorsing the enduring quality of it. Thank you. This is great. I hope you spend some more time thinking about this. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to pause here because what I want to draw attention to is the one thing that is missing from the definitional characteristics of mentoring that you saw on the previous slide, which is the idea of mentoring as social capital, right? The first systematic contemporary analysis of social capital was produced by Pierre Bourdieu, who defined the concept, and here I'm going to go slightly slow because I'm quoting. He defines the concept as, and I'm quoting, the aggregate of the actual or potential resources. I'm focusing on the potential. It's not just what is there, but it's also what exists in potentiality. The actual or potential resources which come into our possession through durable, back to the point that Margot was making, durable networks. And here is the other aspect of it, in institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance. So the mutuality for the institutional component of it, right? Mentoring as or is social capital is the idea that I want us to stay with right now with this slide. Mentoring as social capital is an important reality for us to contend with, because social capital is the thing that helps people get by or get ahead, right? Social capital refers to the benefits and the resources that are both gained and transferred by virtue of the social academic ties we build, the social interactions that we have with our students, and the ones that they have with us. The mutuality of it all is very crucial, right? In some ways, the idea of mentoring was treated for many years as service work, right? As something we do from the goodness of our hearts, out of personal benevolent investment in our students and their success, as a kind of complementary process to what we do in our classrooms. With students, we get sort of more attached to, right? But what that understanding of mentoring masks and obfuscates is how big a role mentoring plays in materially and socially benefiting both parties, in establishing our networks of power, in how we consolidate agency, mobility, credibility within academia. The parties introduce each other to the constellations of their networks, right? Mentoring relationships concretely and in intangible ways or less tangible ways shape the career developments of both parties. It's very much about information sharing, network sharing, knowledge sharing, of course, that enable and ease up the way for us to navigate and succeed in academia. This is how mentoring becomes one of the key ways in which power and privilege are reproduced within the academy. And I want to invite you folks to think about how mentoring operates as reciprocally distributed social capital, right? Not just what you do as mentors for your students, not just how, and this is the point that Adam was talking about, right? Like not just how they are transformed, but how we are transformed and we are benefited, right, by our mentees in our careers. Think about, for example, the ways in which students nominate us for teaching awards. They function also as human capital, right? Young students offer insights we might not have access to. I work with popular culture, and I can tell you I would be nowhere without my students helping me translate Reels and TikTok, right? So they sort of enable a kind of cognitive rejuvenation for us. They help us relatively cheaply with research. That happens all the time, and it's happening with graduate students. It's happening more and more with undergraduate students, right? They enable the enhancement of our mentoring and leadership capacities, right? So when they go to other institutions, they open doors for us out of a sense of loyalty, out of obligation, invite us for guest lectures, involve us in new research collaborations. And so they enable a kind of identity validation for us, right? Go back to what I said in my first slide, which is I didn't just find solid relationships through my mentoring networks that I was embedded in. I also found myself. So they enable an identity validation, right? This is because we discover who we are in the process of supporting and nurturing other people's development, right? This is why we have to think about equity and inclusion in mentoring. Who are the students with whom we organically build and share mentorship and thus consolidate and transfer our social capital? Who are the students we intentionally approach? Why and with what implicit assumptions, right? Who are the students who approach us? And here I'm asking a different sort of question, which is who feels entitled to our time, to our resources and attention? These are all questions of equity in mentoring. So here's the final proposition I want to leave you with when we are thinking about social capital in mentoring, which is mentoring without inclusion and equity is unethical because it redirects attention away from the idea that educational success and excellence are not natural occurrences, but acquired skills, right? It obfuscates attention away from the way we contribute to the excellence of some by offering them access to our mentorship while we ignore the mentoring of some others, perhaps, right? And I don't mean ignoring in this malicious way. That's not what I mean. This can happen for a whole host of reasons, right? And some that are outside of our control and that we must be compassionate to ourselves for. For instance, our classes are too big, right? We are already overburdened with co-curricular responsibilities. So I don't want to turn this into a chastising of us as faculty at all, right? We can't force everyone to avail of ourselves as mentors. This is all very real and valid reasons. But what I'm asking of us is to be more self-aware, critical, and intentional about the mentoring choices we make or those that are made for us, right? I'm asking us to be more deliberate and intentional in how we opt into mentoring networks and recruit our students into them. I'm going to move to the next slide. And here is where the question of the first framework that I want to sort of share with folks, yeah? The question of being more intentional and being more self-aware. We have to start thinking seriously about how our social identity impacts our role as a mentor. For instance, what does it mean for a mentor to not know if and when their mentee is experiencing racism or race-based isolation on campus because the trust needed for that conversation wasn't ever built, right? Or maybe because the mentor hasn't ever thought to consider this possibility or developed the wherewithal, the capacity to initiate such a conversation without further alienating or making assumptions about their students of color, for instance. So again, we want to emphasize that the trustworthiness, I don't know if anybody noticed that phrase in the compilation of the characteristics, trustworthiness, right, of the mentor was a characteristic of the relationship. I want to sort of emphasize that trustworthiness of us as mentors is intimately tied to our capacity, our willingness to engage with equity, our proactiveness in dealing with racism and supporting our students to do the same, not pretending it doesn't exist, not only being passive listeners, not only being angry on their behalf and with them, but actually engaging them meaningfully, right? In thinking about what it means to not just survive, but thrive, right? Not in spite of, but also like together, right? In a collaborative way. We know that students often seek mentors, and this is a really important point that I want to sort of focus on, which is we know that students often seek mentors who they imagine have had similar life experiences, right? Which is why we know that faculty of color, women faculty very often have the most sort of minoritized students coming to them, right? The challenge for us is this: how can we set ourselves up to be good mentors to our students, even if and when our social identity profile differs from those of our students? And here I'm going to say something that few people say today, but I am going to put my weight behind this argument, which is I am really pushing back against the assumption that's become very pervasive in anti-racist discourse and pedagogy, that we are incapable of knowing the experiences of those who are different from us, that people from dominant groups are not capable of knowing the experiences of historically marginalized groups. We might not know it, or they might not know it. I can't say we in this context. They might not know it in some ontological or essentialist way, but we can absolutely understand it and act accordingly, right? To think otherwise and assume the impossibility of understanding is a painfully reductive logic that subscribes to a social identity determinism. To be clear, there is no way that we can ever fully know the experiences of everyone who exists in this world, including everyone in our own social group or racial or national group. I could not possibly speak, for instance, about the experiences of all Indians or all Indian women or even all Indian women from Delhi, which is the city that I'm from. And this is similarly true for white women in academia, right? Or Black faculty in academia, right? And yet in our lives and professional context, we do in fact act for others and in conjunction with others all the time. So let's not suddenly declare this impossible when race or gender or sexual identity, but especially race, are in the mix. The basis for ethical action, right, is precisely to understand differences and make those the basis for collective collaborative action rather than the basis for inaction. So don't let one aspect of social identity like race stand in the way of that just because it's hard to contend with. Let's not reduce our capacities of how we can support our students, which students we can support, to a deterministic logic. Supporting students from different backgrounds might require different skills from us. It might require that we learn about things we don't know enough about, but that is absolutely possible. And one way in which I would like to think about who I am, I like to do this, right? Like, who am I and how that impacts my mentoring, is to think deeply and critically about the mentoring relationships that have impacted me. And this framework I actually borrow from VP Gates, who frames it very nicely. You know, he says, think about what you needed to succeed, what you got, right? What did you need? What did you get? And what do you give back? And here I add a fourth dimension, which is, what have you not considered because you didn't need it or because it wasn't given to you? And therefore, you're not in a position to incorporate it into your mentoring toolkit, right? In other words, what did your experience of mentorship not prepare you to take into account of someone else's experience? And therefore, what do you need to do better at? Don't limit yourself as a mentor to only what you received from your mentors or what you needed from them. Okay, moving on to another big idea and framework. I'm going to give everyone a second to sort of take it all in. What we are focusing on is rejecting deficit framing and what it would mean to adopt asset framing of our students, right? And here there's a little complicated graphic that tells you all the ways in which asset-based pedagogy functions. But the question that I'm sort of also tackling here is this implicit question that gets asked every time we talk about inclusive mentoring, which is this sort of slightly shady, insidious question, which is like, why do some students need more mentoring, right? Like that question, that's the one that I'm taking on here. We're pretending, why do students need mentoring? But the assumption is like, we don't know what to do with the idea that some students might need more mentoring, right? Like, so that's sort of what I want to take on. Having clarity about what deficit and asset-based approaches are is very important to the goal of being good mentors and teachers, because it allows us to teach an increasingly demographically diverse student body to think critically about our pedagogy, right? In other words, clarity about the difference between deficit and asset-based approaches allows us to move from being able to just articulate the value of our diverse student population, from saying, oh yeah, they matter, and instead move towards the next step of really saying, how do they matter? How much do they matter? How much does the diversity of our student body really matter to us? It allows us to move beyond good intentions to intentional actions, right? And for the purposes of clarifying what deficit framing is, I want you to imagine our campus as a pond with its own ecosystem. And here, I wish this was my own analogy, but you will see with how I explain it, how bad I am with water body analogies. I'm borrowing this analogy from a consultant friend of mine, Sumi Pedankar, who I respect a lot, and I've sort of learned a lot about DEI and higher education from her. So here's the analogy, right? Our goal is to bring students from all walks of life, with all kinds of lived experiences from all geographical, racial, ethnic, class contexts to this campus, right? I want us to start thinking of the college campus as a kind of pond, right? In the pond analogy, what we effectively are saying is we want all the fish here. The black fish, first gen fish, Latinx fish, working class fish, international fish, etc., etc. But here's how it works, right? Like, which is what happens if we don't do anything to build the ecosystem in a way that will help all these different fish survive, let alone thrive. So if, say, we don't bring the food that the particular fish need, we don't build the new water pathways, we don't bring the friends that the fish need in the pond, we don't keep the groundwater clean. I told you I'm not good with water body analogies, so be generous with me here. But what happens, we know what happens, right? Like, which is, if we don't sustain and enrich the ecosystem, the fish will come and die. And by that, I mean, of course, spiritually, psychologically, and intellectually, right? And this is where it takes a dark turn, which is, we have to know that this is what we see all the time with students of color and their experiences of microaggression and race-based trauma that they incur. It's also true for what happens to queer, trans, disabled students, working class students, all the students for whom our institutions weren't originally built, right? And then when the fish don't do well or struggle to succeed in this ecosystem we've created, then we say, aha, the fish weren't prepared. They didn't fit into our culture. They didn't come from families that value education enough. They didn't know how to navigate our professional standards, right? This is a fully deficit-minded framework, which is that we blame students for the conditions that didn't allow them to thrive. We can very quickly surmise the dangers of deficit framing our students, right? It's an implicit and covert ideology because it works very often without us being aware that we're operating within it or that it's operating through us. It is colorblind. It relies on the myth of individual meritocracy, which misleadingly implies that it's not systemic inequalities, but individual deficiencies that are the major cause for unequal outcomes in higher education. It reinforces long-standing oppressive ideas and beliefs that people of color, particularly Blacks, are intellectually deficient. It can also produce the extremely insidious and dangerous disrespectful policy, and I'll be talking about this a lot, which is of going easy on groups of underperforming students, right? And this is what people who talk about inclusive anything are being accused of all the time. Oh, you just want to lower the standards, right? And that's called the Pobrecito Syndrome, that is lowering our expectations for students of color, assuming that they're not capable of excellence. And so we opt out of doing the work of nurturing them to succeed and giving them what they need and simply change our standard, right? And this is a great anxiety, like I was saying, that people express when we talk about inclusion, that we're compromising on rigor, which is the exact opposite of what we're actually talking about. Because what we're making a case for is for rigor to be made accessible to all, right? So let's be clear. The truth is, and here I'm answering that question that's on the slide, that all students have needs. They all need investment in their success, engagement with the expansion of their capacities, and the nurturing of their skills. All students need that. The difference is that some students receive this nurturing and some don't. Some receive enough, some receive insufficient amounts, and some receive not what they need, but what's generically on offer, right? The problem isn't with the students, it's with a structure that inequitably grants opportunities and support. That's why I always like to remember the hashtag fix the system, not the students, right? The problem with deficit framing is also that it produces the faulty discourse of grit, which suggests that it's students' individual deficiency which is responsible for any challenges they experience in education. Presuming we can resolve racial inequities, for instance, by simply teaching students of color to have grit is like presuming, and here I'm using Paul Gorski's analogy, is like presuming we can resolve climate change by teaching coastal communities to swim faster. Because it shifts the onus of responsibility away from schools and onto the very students who are cheated out of equal opportunity, and who, as a matter of fact, due to this cheating, often already tend to be quite resilient. Grit will not get students anywhere against a curriculum that doesn't recognize them in their context, or school policies, recruitment and retention processes that don't address past and present inequalities that we exist within and that surround us, right? And so I'm now going to move away from deficit framing, and talk about why we have to give it up for asset framing and what that means, right? Asset framing isn't simply about celebrating diversity in the classroom in a way that tokenizes students from underrepresented or underserved backgrounds. It's actually the linchpin of what makes or breaks our mentoring pedagogy as being relevant and responsive to being student-centered. Because here is what changes when we approach our mentoring or our teaching with an asset-based lens. We stop thinking of ourselves as the sole agents in the classroom who respond to or determine what is relevant to and for our students' needs. On the contrary, we invite, welcome, and equip students with the tools. We give them the venue to be able to make those decisions for themselves. And we believe strongly and actively that each of our students is capable of learning, growing, contributing meaningfully and positively to their learning environment and to the world, given the right support and nurturing. Our job is to create the conditions, the context, the opportunities for them to succeed, to be able to explore their potential, activate their questions, their explorations, their experimentations, right, with who they are and who they want to be and how they apply what they learn from us and with us. And so what we have to do is consciously counteract and disrupt the deficiencies in higher education. That's something we have to do all the time, but also the deficiencies of deficit framing that we have internalized in our approach to students. We have to undertake a transformation of our pedagogical consciousness. What we need to do as a university, as a college, as a department, as individual faculty, is that we have to very intentionally articulate to our student what we individually and institutionally offer them. Because remember, social capital is about institutional ties, right? So it's not just enough what you as an individual faculty can do for them. What does the institution do is very crucial. What do we offer them to help them support and thrive? What will we offer them that will allow them to be retained, to be welcome, to belong? What is our cultural landscape and how do we contribute to that landscape, right? This doesn't need to look like simply confirming what our students know and think. On the contrary, it requires a genuine and generous invitation to them to know more, to know differently than they already do, in a way that changes them and us in the process, back to the transformational quality of mentoring, right? And that it impacts all of us. We have to ask ourselves what we are doing to offer our students an education and a mentorship that is culturally, emotionally, professionally relevant to them and relevant to the world they want to inhabit and to the world we want them to shape and participate in, right? It's what they desire, and it's what we desire, all coming together in a collaborative way. And an education that does that belongs to an asset-based framework. And here I'm going to wind up so that we have a solid 20 minutes to talk together, right? And here, remember I was saying the third framework is not really a framework, it's a how-to kind of moving towards actual process. We can start thinking about these questions seriously, right? Which is how do we start? How do we initiate our mentoring relationships? And what might we need to do in order to change how we do it, right? Do you wait for your students to come to you? Do you identify promising students and reach out? And again, I want to sort of do a shout out, which is some of these questions I've worked out with, in working with the PIRE team, Christopher Munt, Nastasha Johnson, and Dan Guggenheim, if you're on the call or not, a shout out to you and a thank you to you folks for being colleagues and mentors. How do you identify promising students and reach out to them? What does promising mean to you? Do only promising students deserve mentoring? Right? Like, these are all good questions to ask yourself each time you're drawn to a student or you notice a student being drawn to you. And I'm going to end with this, and I'm going to, if it's all right with everyone, I'm going to stop sharing. But this is my key question that I would love for us to start with, and start by sort of, unmuting ourselves or using the chat function to start answering the question, how can you invite students into your mentoring networks without tokenizing them? And one way I can launch that sort of a set of responses to this would be by saying, be explicit about what you think about mentoring and its importance, right? Be explicit in saying you think everyone needs mentoring, right? Be sure that your students know this, right? And find creative ways of saying this and reiterating it.